Today for our Moravian reading, we are in Acts 10, verse 24 to 33, and it's a continuation of the story of Peter and Cornelius. If you remember, Cornelius was a Roman convert to Judaism, a man of influence, but he would have always been treated as an outsider by those born Jewish, and possibly by the Jewish followers of Jesus, if it had not been for this vision of food that God had given to Peter. So God commanded Peter to eat all the non-kosher, all the religiously unclean food of the Old Testament in order to show Peter that it's by grace through faith that we are saved and made holy and righteous in God's sight. And that same grace that could cleanse a Jew like Peter could cleanse a non-Jew, a Gentile like Cornelius, and make them into one family. So it's a story of grace, a story of ethnic and racial unity, and it's a story of identity. How our identity as a follower of Jesus has to trump and supersede any other identity labels that we might place on ourselves, whether that be political or vegan or sexuality-wise or anything. Now in today's reading, Peter and some other disciples arrive at Cornelius' house and they enter, they're breaking Jewish laws. Cornelius welcomes Peter in. He becomes a person of peace to Cornelius. And I just wonder how many people might be waiting for you and I to bring good news to them. I wonder how many people might be praying to God and we might be the answer to that prayer. Cornelius bows in reverence to Peter. Peter is quick to address that. He wants everyone to know that he is not the special one. He's an ordinary guy. That is so important. Otherwise, it would give the impression that God only uses special people rather than Jesus working through ordinary people like me and like you. Peter then explains this kairos revelation that is experienced in a vision. God is now calling all people clean, or we might say acceptable to him. It's why racism is so evil and anti-God. Even subtle things like talking about, those people coming over here and taking our jobs. No, those people are loved by God. They are acceptable to God. God's desire is to unify us by his Spirit, as he's doing in this passage. So then Peter, in pretty typical Peter style, he says, I came to you without objection, which isn't quite true, is it? God told him to eat and he said no 3 times to God. But Peter got there in the end by God's grace. And I was just reflecting today on how gracious God was to Peter, how patient God was with Peter, how God was okay with this gradual revelation for Peter. God didn't expect Peter to get it all, understand it all, everything at once straight away. Peter was a work in progress by God's grace. I was just thinking about how Peter had, before meeting Cornelius the Gentile, he'd been staying at Simon the Tanner's. I mean, even in that, God had been loosening the hold of religiousness on Peter and preparing Peter. Simon, a Jewish name, he was a tanner. But Jews weren't allowed to touch dead animals, which is tricky if you're a tanner making leather, isn't it? And so the rules said a tanner had to live 75 feet out of the village. In fact, if you got engaged to someone that became a tanner, you could legally annul the marriage. And so God had been placing Peter in this household of dead animals, an increasingly uncomfortable, challenging, stretching situation to prepare him for the work to which he'd been called, to help him to form this new kind of community that was outside of his understanding, a community of different types of people. So I pray that we would know God's grace in that way today. The sort of grace that empowers us to love and serve and witness to even the most unlikely of people. The sort of witness and love that takes us out of our comfort zones and into God's plans for his world. Amen.